On March 4th, 2025, the PlayStation 2 will celebrate its 25th anniversary. When the console came onto the market in 2000, nobody could have guessed that the PS2 would become the most successful console of all time, well, at least until today. To mark the anniversary, let's take a look back at the history of the console, examine the market environment and talk about some of the most important PlayStation 2 games. Because one thing is clear, the PS2 has achieved something that no other system has managed before. It has redefined the video game landscape and changed it forever with its success. But Sony didn't have it easy in the first few years, as we'll soon find out. So grab a snack, a drink and travel with me to the 2000s. I hope you will have lots of fun. According to Sony, the PS2 sold 160 million in stores around the world, although the number was recently revised upwards against following the strong Switch sales figures, after the total sales figures for years had been given as over 155 million units sold. But okay, let's leave the 160 million times as they are. Over 4,000 games were released on the PlayStation 2, which was on the market for an incredible 12 years and dominated the 6th console generation before Sony pulled the plug at the beginning of 2013 and announced that it would stop production. But the Japanese electronics company didn't have it easy with the second console. After all, it had to repeat the success of the first PlayStation in a market environment that was characterized by rapid technological progress and a new competitor. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back a few years first. The launch year of the PS1 to be precise, because when Sony released their first console in Japan at the end of 1994, the video game world was different overnight. Even if the PlayStation was weak at launch in Japan and Sega's Saturn was able to generate more sales, which was not least due to Sega's market position at the time and the popularity of Virtua Fighter, which was available for the Saturn at launch. But Sony caught up, secured immense third-party support, and the rest is history, which you can watch in my PS1 documentary. Ken Kutaragi, the spiritual father of the PlayStation, immediately started thinking about a successor after the console was released, which basically seems quite logical but fell on deaf ears with Sony's management. After all, the Sony bosses were against the PS1 and did not see themselves in the console business. And without the support of Sony boss Norio Oga, the console would not have been realized after all, but you already know that if you watched my video. Not much is known about the development of the PS2, especially if you're looking for information on the early stages of development. But Kutaragi had to struggle again while standing up to most of the Sony bosses. It was only when the PS1 began to generate increasing success from 1996 onwards and really took off from 1997 onwards that even the harshest PlayStation critics were convinced internally and a successor console finally got the green light. At some point during this time, Argonaut Games employees were apparently commissioned by semiconductor manufacturer LSI to develop a rendering chip for Sony's next console. During the work on the chip, however, there was no direct contact with Sony itself. According to Argonaut's founder Jess San, communication only took place via LSI. Argonaut Games later learned that Sony was developing its own chip internally and had commissioned other companies to produce rendering chips just to diversify its own development while exploring all options, similar to what Sega did with the Dreamcast. I would bet that Psygnosis was also working on a chip or another hardware during this time, but there is no solid sources for this. In mid-97, Sony was already busy working behind the scenes when Ken Kutaragi was promoted and appointed CEO of Sony Computer Entertainment. Ken Kutaragi took on his new position with a crystal clear vision. He didn't want to develop the next Sony console just for children's rooms, but to create an entertainment machine with which he could conquer living rooms. In the same year, the first rumors about the next PlayStation appeared, but Sony did not comment on them. Kutaragi himself faced a new challenge at the end of the year. The DVD format, developed in collaboration between Sony and Philips, was nearing completion. At 4.7 GB, a DVD had a significantly larger capacity than a conventional CD and was set to revolutionize the film industry the following year. Kutaragi did not miss the potential of the brand new DVD technology. He wanted to have games pressed on DVD and also suggested that the new console should play DVD movies, a suggestion that once again fell on deaf ears with Sony management. They remembered that the PS1's ability to play music CDs had led to a decline in sales of CD players and now feared that the release of the PS2 would lead to a decline in sales of DVD players, which Sony naturally wanted to sell with the introduction of the new DVD medium. But Kutaragi was not to be discouraged and reportedly fought for months to get the new console to play DVDs, but was reportedly rebuffed until Norio Oga again intervened and put his foot down. Given the popularity of the PlayStation 1, he believed in Kutaragi's vision and gave his plan the green light, again against the will of his management. And as for general hardware development, the market was booming in the late 1990s. It seemed as though every 6 months new and more powerful processors and graphic cards from Videologic and 3DFX appeared, which were in tough competition with each other. The rumor mill was swelling and many fans were wondering who from Sony would get the contract, but the Japanese console manufacturer had no intention of approaching Videologic or 3DFX. Instead, they teamed up with Toshiba and invested over $2 billion in the development of a processor that would make waves as the Emotion Engine. As the heart of the new console, the Emotion Engine ensured that games would run as well as possible, both graphically and technically. To ensure this, the processor took on several tasks. The Emotion Engine offered enough power to handle all of the calculations required for graphics, movement and physics in a video game. It was also responsible for rendering 3D graphics, which was a major focus for the new PlayStation console. The processor also helped process audio and calculated the artificial intelligence of opponents and other NPCs in the new games, so that they reacted intelligently and did not just move mindlessly through the game world. Compared to the processors of other consoles at the time, the Emotion Engine was quite advanced. It had many specialized processing units that could perform different tasks simultaneously, which was particularly useful in the more demanding games. Sony itself said the Emotion Engine was powerful enough to, quote, create real emotions in video game characters. However, the new processor also caused quite a headache for many game developers, as we will see in a moment. It would take some time before development studios got the Emotion Engine and the rest of the hardware well under control. And while Toshiba was working on the hardware together with the engineers at Sony, Ken Kutaragi was thinking about the name of the new system. Ultimately, the PlayStation father decided not to change the brand name known all over the world and simply put a 2 at the end. Yes, the new name wasn't really innovative, but it ensured that everybody immediately knew where they were with the new console. The PlayStation 2 was supposed to be the technically better successor to the PS1, nothing more, nothing less. The design of the new console turned out to be a major challenge that Teiji Goto faced. Goto had already created the look of the PS1 and thus made the console extremely recognizable. Ken Kutaragi only had one instruction with which he approached the designer at Sony: create a design that appeals to everyone. Well, you can probably imagine that this was easier said than done. Teiji Goto struggled, creating several different designs, all of which were reportedly rejected. At some point, an Atari PC caught his attention, the Falcon 030 Microbox. The PC was never released by Atari, but Sony bought the design rights from Atari when the company was in free fall. Goto was very impressed by the look of the Atari PC and used it as the basis for a new design proposal that ultimately convinced Ken Kutaragi. A reference to the Falcon Microbox can even be found in the patent application for the PS2 design, which I think is a nice tribute to the Atari original. Teiji Goto chose black as the console color. It was supposed to represent the universe, and the blue PS2 logo in the middle was supposed to symbolize the Earth, which was at the center of a new universe. Kutaragi took up the design and from then on said, quote, "The PlayStation 2 will open a door to a new universe." In addition to the design of the console, the game cases were also put on the test. Since PlayStation 2 games were to be pressed onto black DVDs in the future if they did not fit on a conventional CD, Sony Japan decided to deliver PlayStation 2 games in DVD cases. This meant that the breakable plastic cases that we got in Europe with PS1 games were finally a thing of the past, because unlike with its first console, Sony wanted to keep the design of the game boxes for the PS2 the same worldwide. The controller controller was also kept the same, which was not surprising to many, since Sony had only released the DualShock in Japan in December 97, before it came to the West in 98. The further development of the original PS1 controller was very well received, so the DualShock was used as a basis for the development of the PS2 controller and only changed minimally. The biggest change was certainly the buttons. All 4 face buttons, the 4 shoulder buttons and all the 4 buttons on the D-pad were touch sensitive on the DualShock 2, which meant that you could press them to different degrees, for example to influence the speed in racing games. Sony marketed this new feature heavily at the start of the PS2 era, but only a few games made use of it, so that the pressure-sensitive buttons were forgotten over time. Otherwise, the DualShock 2 was the same color as the console itself, had a blue DualShock logo and was included as a standard controller with every console, although Sony also wanted to offer the controller separately for purchase at launch. As for the console itself, you could place it either vertically or horizontally, or lay it down. On the front, the PS2 had 2 controller ports and 2 memory card slots above them. It was interesting that Sony had once again only opted for 2 controller ports, although the trend among other console manufacturers of the 6th console generation was clearly towards 4 controller ports. If 4 people wanted to play on one console, PlayStation 2 owners had to use a multi-tap, which Sony offered separately at a relatively high price. On the right was the drive, which could be extended by pressing the button next to it, and was to become the first major weak point in terms of software piracy, but more on that later. Other than that, the only other thing on the front was the power button, which also served as a reset button. Below the grooved front, Sony also installed 2 USB ports and a Firewire port, which the manufacturer called an iLink port, and which allowed 2 PlayStation 2 systems to be connected to one another. On the back of the console, in addition to the fan grille and the obligatory power and video cable connections, there was also a toggle switch that could be used to turn the console off completely, as well as a digital audio input and an expansion slot. If you had a suitable adapter, you could use a hard drive with the PlayStation 2, which later made sense with some online capable games, and now is used primarily for homebrew purposes. And while Sega was already busy preparing the launch of the Dreamcast in 98 and was very well received by fans and the press in preview reports, Sony was also quite ready to announce the PlayStation 2, for example to take out the wind out of the wings of the competition from Sega. However, PS1 consoles sold like hotcakes. Several blockbusters such as Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2 and Gran Turismo gave Sony a more than successful year. So the decision was made internally not to announce the new console so as not to harm their own sales. They did not want to destroy the momentum that the PS1 had in 1998, which was quite understandable even if Sony even went a step further. Every rumor that emerged was vehemently denied. Sony announced that no new console was being worked on internally, even though the rumors just wouldn't die down. In November 1998, the announcement of a new console came. Not from Sony, however, but from VM Labs, who brought Project X to the public. The console with the mysterious name was supposed to have DVD playback capability and display games with much nicer graphics than gamers were used to with the N64 or PS1, and all at an affordable price. So basically what the rumored new PlayStation from Sony could do. After the initial hype, Project X didn't really cause much of a stir. Although the company VM Labs was backed by former Atari programmers who had previously worked on the Atari Jaguar and wanted to bring Project X onto the market as a spiritual successor to the Jaguar, the guys ran out of money before they could really make a name for themselves. So VM Labs decided not to release Project X as a stationary console, but to license the console hardware to various manufacturers of DVD players, similar to what the 3DO company had done a few years earlier with the 3DO console. It was not until the summer of 2000 that DVD players from Samsung, Toshiba and other manufacturers came onto the market that had integrated the console hardware, which was known at the time as Nuon. Unfortunately, Nuon was a huge flop and the DVD player console hybrid was quickly forgotten, with only 8 games released, all of them sequels to well-known Atari Jaguar games. But the reason I mention Nuon, or rather Project X, in connection with the PS2 is an interesting rumor that says that Sony panicked a little after the announcement of the Project X console in November 98 and only then decided to build DVD playback capability into the PS2. If you believe this rumor, a flopped console by ex-Atari employees would be the only reason why Sony's PS2 could play DVD films, which would be quite funny. However, I personally think that Kutaragi's vision after he got his nose into DVD technology internally has more meat to it. But whatever. At the end of 1998 there wasn't only one thing to marvel at. In addition to the Project X console, the Sega Dreamcast finally came onto the market in Japan in December and blew gamers' socks off. The graphics were breathtaking and better than anything that we had seen in the console sector before. But it wasn't just Sega that went all out. Nintendo did too when they released Zelda Ocarina of Time in the same month, revolutionizing the action-adventure genre. Only Sony remained silent and left the rumor mill to the media. At the beginning of 1999, the first development kits were sent out to selected developers, who began to develop first PlayStation 2 games. Information about the delivery of the dev kits leaked to the press, which of course again caused heated rumors. In February, Edge magazine published an article with lots of information about the release date, the price and the hardware that would probably be used. Denying this would damage Sony's credibility, so the company decided to finally talk about the next PlayStation generation. In March, Sony invited people to a special press conference at which the PlayStation 2 was unveiled. They showed the design, the controller, talked about the ability to play DVD movies and also announced that the entire PS1 game library could be played on the PS2. This was followed by a series of tech demos that impressively demonstrated the power of the Emotion Engine, while the new processor was the focus of the entire presentation. All previous rumors ultimately had come true. The PlayStation 2 was every PS1's owner's dream come true. The 9 tech demos that were shown in March promised groundbreaking graphics. The quality that PS1 owners knew from the pre-rendered cutscenes of their PS1 games was to be rendered in real time on the PS2, which of course made fans incredibly excited. DVD movies were to be able to be played using additional hardware that Sony wanted to present in more detail at a later date. Most people hoped that the later date meant E3 in May 1999, but Sony's appearance at the world's largest video game trade fair was a disappointment. While Nintendo unleashed the Pokémon on the West, brought a bunch of new N64 games with it, and even revealed initial information about its new console, Sony showed the same tech demos that had already been shown in March. The company had little information about the PS2 and left the stage to the PS1 and some new games for the first PlayStation. This allowed Sega to be in the spotlight, thrilling fans with Sonic Adventure and many other Dreamcast games, and also announcing a release date for the Western market. After the E3, a massive advertising campaign was launched in the US to prepare for the launch of the Dreamcast on September 9, 1999. Sega took advantage of Sony's cautious release of information and had a very successful Dreamcast launch. A total of 50,000 consoles were sold in the US in the first 2 weeks, and the European release in October was also a complete success, with 500,000 Dreamcast consoles sold in the first month. And then came the Tokyo Game Show. At this, Sony held a major presentation on the PS2. Ken Kutaragi personally hosted the event and spoke of how the PlayStation 2 was the focus of the Sony brand, unlike at the start of the PlayStation 1. He emphasized the backwards compatibility again before he talked about the new DualShock controller and the pressure-sensitive buttons. The memory cards were also mentioned. These were 8 times larger than the memory cards on the PS1 and could store significantly more save games. The previously announced additional hardware for DVD movies was cancelled. Kutaragi announced that the PS2 would natively play all DVD movies before turning to the topic of internet. The PlayStation 2 was to be internet capable. The PlayStation further announced a brand new online service that would allow users to load pictures, music and movies onto the PlayStation 2. The console had a slot for hard drives that could be fitted to the console, which seemed absolutely groundbreaking groundbreaking and even futuristic at the end of 1999. Towards the end, he talked about the release period and the price of the console. It was to be released in Japan on March 4th, 2000. The console would cost 39,800 yen if 1 million units were on store shelves on launch day. It was the biggest console launch to date and in the still young history of video games. Sony didn't skimp, they went big. And all Tokyo Game Show visitors were able to enjoy playable demos that were available on Sony's exhibition grounds. And here one thing was immediately apparent. The playable demos were all good, but not on the same level of the tech demos that Sony had shown in March and May. The graphical difference did not destroy the hype in the slightest, however. Sony's appearance at the Tokyo Game Show made the masses forget about Sega's Dreamcast. March 4th, 2000 couldn't come quickly enough. And there were also new rumors that Microsoft was working on a console in the USA that was technically superior to the PS2. And there was Nintendo, who had finally left the cartridge technology behind and were working on a system that would also overtake the PlayStation 2. The coming year promised to be very exciting. The new millennium dawned and the gaming world was looking towards Japan to the Sony headquarters. But before the PlayStation 2 was finally released in March, Squaresoft was making waves. The Squaresoft Millennium event took place on February 1st, 2000 and was all about Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy IX was announced for the PS1 and was due to be released in Japan in summer 2000. Much more exciting were two other Final Fantasy games that Squaresoft developed for Sony's new platform. Final Fantasy X and XI were two new games that were announced and scheduled for release in Japan next year. The 10th part was to continue the tradition of the series, while Final Fantasy XI was to be the first online role-playing game in the Final Fantasy universe, to be released exclusively on the PS2. Squaresoft once again emphasized the successful collaboration with Sony, and the three new Final Fantasy games were evidence that the collaboration would not change for the time being. And then the time had finally come. On March 4th, 2000, the PlayStation 2 was available for purchase and there was no stopping in Japan. Long queues formed in front of the department stores and even the police had to show their presence to prevent chaos from breaking out. The previous reportings, the powerful marketing and the countless rumors had not failed to have their effect. In just 2 days, Sony was able to sell 1 million consoles and was faced with a problem, because many Japanese people were left empty-handed. Sony has delivered 1 million consoles to retailers and planned that they would get by for the first 6 days. No one had expected that the delivered quantity would be sold out after just 2 days, which caused the company to have supply problems. It was also strange that the Japanese government imposed an export ban and thus prohibited the sale of the consoles abroad. The reason was that the government classified Sony's new console as a supercomputer and was afraid that someone from abroad would use the technology against them. This situation led to wild rumors. Suddenly it was said that Saddam Hussein got his hands on countless consoles and used them to build a supercomputer to attack the USA. Despite the great success, however, many technical problems overshadowed the launch. Many fans and magazines reported graphic errors in their PS1 games that they played on the new console. In addition, memory cards crashed randomly when trying to save game scores. And in many cases, buyers complained about system crashes, which is of course more than just annoying with a new console. In addition, a secret function was found in the DVD function of the PS2 that made it possible to play movies from all regions on the console, something that was actually prohibited by a region lock. There was an international agreement in the movie industry. This stipulated that DVD movies could only be played on the corresponding region. The aim was to prevent movies from being watched in parts of the world where they just had not yet been released, whether in cinemas or in stores. Bypassing the region lock on the PS2 resulted in a violation. Sony was forced to deliver an update on DVD to all PlayStation 2 buyers and to appeal to them to install the update themselves. You can imagine that very few people heeded the call. Apart from the technical problems, it was the 10 launch games that were not particularly exciting. So let's take a quick look at the games and explore the quality of the Japanese launch lineup. Let's start with A-Train 6, a train simulation that did not necessarily demonstrate the power of the Emotion Engine and was only for hardcore fans of train simulations. Drum Mania was the port of a popular arcade game, but it certainly wasn't a draw for the new PlayStation. From Software contributed Eternal Ring, an action role-playing game that was definitely worth a closer look, even if its graphics were far from the quality of the tech demos that Sony had massively promoted a year ago. With Kakenogi Shogi 4 and Morita Shogi, there were two shogi games for fans of the board game, but they weren't exactly system sellers. The same can be said about Mahjong Taikai 3, no console launch in Japan without a Mahjong game. With Kessen, Koei brought a real-time strategy game onto the market that was certainly one of the more interesting launch titles, and was able to generate a bit of attention, even if the lack of fine-tuning was criticized by fans and the press. Unfortunately, the only big hit at launch didn't fare much better, as the eagerly awaited Ridge Racer 5 also fell short of expectations. After the terrific fourth installment on PlayStation 1, the fifth installment didn't offer anything new. The graphics were consistent, but they were mostly just recycled tracks and cars from previous installments. With stepping selection, Jaleco contributed a dance game, but that didn't entice anyone out of their comfort zone either. And finally there was Capcom's Street Fighter X3, a brand new Street Fighter game in 3D, which made you want more, but in terms of gameplay it fell short of the installments of the main series, which probably had something to do with the fact that Capcom had Street Fighter X3 developed by an external studio again. And yeah, as you can see, the Japanese launch games were rather boring, apart from Ridge Racer 5 and maybe Street Fighter X3 and Eternal Ring, and also had to contend with technical problems. Many new PlayStation 2 owners reported glitches, bugs and horrendous loading times in their new games. Considering that Sony had marketed the Emotion Engine in this new console as the next big thing in the gaming industry, the games left a lot to be desired. There was no sign of lifelike emotions or groundbreaking graphics when the PS2 was launched in Japan. The quality of the games did not play a particularly large role in terms of sales of the console, however. The PlayStation 2 did not sell well because it was a new console, but because it could play DVD movies. The release of the system came in the middle of a DVD hype in the land of the rising sun. Most people got a PS2 because a standalone DVD player usually cost a lot more. And with the PS2 you even got a game console on top of a high quality Sony DVD player. Most people couldn't say no to that. It was the biggest console launch of all time for Sony, and up to this point also the biggest launch of a video game system in the history of video games. Only very few people wanted the games. That's why video gamers look eagerly to Los Angeles in June, where the E3 started and was all about the next generation. Sega showed off loads of new Dreamcast games. They were clearly struggling to fight against the popularity of the PS2 and tried to do so with one hit after another, while Nintendo continued to rely on the N64 and brought games like Banjo-Tooie, Zelda Majora's Mask and Perfect Dark. Even Microsoft was represented at the trade fair, although they stayed behind the scenes and were looking to back the first big deals with developers and publishers. And Sony, well, they talked about PlayStation 2 accessories, threw around sales figures and presented a great Metal Gear Solid 2 trailer. Beyond that, not much else was announced, and Sony came out as a small loser in the E3 comparison, which suggested a stagnation in the software supply for the PS2. And that before the all-important Western release of the console in October. In order not to completely mess this up, Sony hired the filmmaker David Lynch and asked him to produce a commercial for the West. Lynch immediately got to work and created a very bizarre commercial that was different from anything that had been seen before from a video game and console manufacturer. The commercial, with the promising name "Welcome to the Third Place," did not fail to have an impact in the West and appealed to exactly the target group that Sony was hoping for: adult gamers who had already enjoyed the PS2 and had little to do with the Sega and Nintendo systems. Interest in the PlayStation continued to grow in the West, despite the meager game library. In Japan too, more PlayStation 2 consoles were sold in the first 6 months after launch than the total number of PS2 games. In the eyes of most buyers, the console was still just a DVD player with a nice PlayStation bonus and not the other way around. This got to the point where Sony had more and more difficulties producing new supplies, also because, in addition to the high level of interest, there was a shortage of electronic components that were essential for the production of the new consoles. In order to meet the demand in Japan and the USA for the US release, Sony decided to postpone the European release planned for October 26th. So November 24 was now considered, which annoyed many fans here in Germany and other European countries. At the same time, the PlayStation 2 was becoming more and more of a financial problem for Sony. Since the company sold the system at a loss and was unable to generate the software sales it had hoped for, the PlayStation 2 slowly but surely became a loss-making business. According to reports, Sony made a loss of $100 for every PlayStation sold. And that was perfectly normal, since console manufacturers subsidized their systems with software sales. But since the majority of PlayStation 2 buyers continued to use the system only as a DVD player and ignored the mostly half-baked and average games, Sony was unable to cover its production costs. That was finally to change with the US release, since 29 games were available to buy there, including a few real hit candidates. At the same time, Sony tried to regroup the costs by selling accessories, but this meant that accessories such as memory cards, controllers and multi-tap or a silly stand were offered at high prices, which was not met with approval everywhere. At least the engineers had managed to get the technical problems known from Japan under control in time for the Western release. When the PlayStation 2 was shipped to America and a little later to Europe, the system no longer suffered from glitches, bugs or system crashes. When the time came on October 26, 2000, the PS2 had long since become a cultural phenomenon in the West. Similar to Japan, long queues formed in front of department stores. People queued for hours or even slept in front of department stores several hours before the sales start to get one of the consoles. Sony had already come up with a marketing strategy in advance to explain the slow supply of hardware. It was said that the console was so popular that there simply wouldn't be enough systems for every PlayStation fan. The shortage was used as a hype tool, and Sony actually managed to make the PlayStation 2 even more desirable in this way. The 500,000 units that Sony delivered to American retailers on October 26th were sold out in just a few hours. Many fans in the US also went away empty-handed, which Sega wanted to take advantage of. The price of the Dreamcast was reduced, but unfortunately no one cared anymore. The PlayStation 2 was the hot shit that everyone wanted, and Sony once again didn't know what to do with the money that being thrown at them. But let's take a look at the 29 launch games that were available in the USA. A total of 4 games from the Japan launch lineup made the jump across the pond. Eternal Ring from Software, Kessen from Koei, Ridge Racer 5 from Namco and Street Fighter X3 from Capcom. With Armored Core 2, From Software also contributed the latest installment of their popular mech action games, which was perfect for action fans. Gun Griffin Blaze was also available as an alternative, although it fared a little worse in the reviews compared to Armored Core. There were 3 fighting games to choose from, whether it was Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore, an expanded port of the Dreamcast original, a PS2 version of Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2 from Midway, or Tekken Tag Tournament from Namco. Genre fans were spoiled for choice. On the role-playing front, there was another role-playing game from Software alongside Eternal Ring. Unlike Eternal Ring, which was described as a slow action RPG with a tough level of difficulty and a first-person perspective, Evergrace was a third-person action RPG with a dynamic combat system and 2 characters, each with their own campaign, which provided replay value, although both games ended up in the lower middle range in terms of ratings. RPG fans could still switch to Orphan Scion of Sorcery from Activision or Summoner from THQ. The former was a video game adaptation based on a successful anime, but was not very convincing in terms of gameplay, while the latter was a successful action role-playing game with a great atmosphere, good combat and large game world. In a direct comparison, Summoner received the best reviews and was the best choice for genre fans at launch. Hitmaker Konami had 3 games ready for launch, but they were all rather mediocre. Firstly, there was an arcade port of Silent Scope, which was only half much as fun without a suitable sniper controller. Secondly, sports fans were delighted with 2 sports games. ESPN International Track and Field featured various disciplines, while ESPN X Winter Games Snowboarding was meant to appeal to snow fans. And where there are sports games, Electronic Arts is a must. EA had 5 titles at the PS2 launch, all of which were very well received, well, with one exception at last. Ice hockey and football fans were delighted with NHL 2001 and Madden NFL 2001, both of which were impressive with strong reviews in the 90s, while snowboard fans passed the time with the brilliant SSX, which had the best score of all launch games with an average rating of 92% and was to launch a whole series. Swing Away Golf was an entertaining golf simulation game that was graphically reminiscent of Sony's own Everybody's Golf series and impressed with a good rating of 78%. Only X-Squad, a third-person shooter developed internally at Electronic Arts, fell far short from expectations and is now considered one of the worst PS2 games of all time. Let's take a look at a few racing games. If you didn't like Ridge Racer 5, you could try MotoGP, which was also published by Namco and had the same rating as Ridge Racer 5. 2 other racing games came from Rockstar. Midnight Club was a classic racing game with a great street racing atmosphere, while Smuggler's Run was much more action-packed. Here you were a smuggler and had to transport drugs and other hot goods from A to B, while enemy smugglers or even cops were breathing down your neck. If you wanted something a little more relaxed, you could try Wild Wild Racing. The buggy racer from Rage Software and Interplay couldn't keep up with the strong competition in the genre. If you weren't keen on driving and preferred more action, you could be happy with Dynasty Warriors 2 from Koei. Unlike its predecessor on PS1, which was still a pure fighting game, Dynasty Warriors 2 was an entertaining action title in which you and your protagonist had to fight through countless hordes of enemy soldiers, which certainly reflected the power of the PlayStation 2 and wouldn't have been possible on the previous console. Fans of first-person shooters were happy with Unreal Tournament and Timesplitters. The latter in particular was quite interesting, as the developers were former Rare employees who had already proven their skills in the genre with GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. Timesplitters lacked a good single-player mode, but the game was perfect for multiplayer evenings. And if you wanted to take it easy, you could play Cue Ball Billiard Masters. However, the game didn't get much traction in reviews and, like many other launch games, ended up in the lower middle range. And then there was Fantavision, the only first-party game from Sony for the new console. With an average rating of 72%, Fantavision also ended up in the middle range of launch games, but was still quite entertaining if you got involved in the somewhat different puzzle game. The aim here was to set up fireworks by connecting the explosions of the rockets, which also increased your own high score. The great light and particle effects were impressive, but most PlayStation 2 owners had hoped for something different from Sony to demonstrate the power of the new console. As you can see, the US lineup was much better than the Japanese launch. Many genres were covered and the games themselves were also better received by fans and the press. Nevertheless, software sales were modest. Ridge Racer 5, Tekken and Street Fighter with their average ratings were not the mega hits that fans had expected. System sellers were again lacking. And when the European launch came 2 months later, the scenario repeated itself. The PS2 sold like hotcakes, and that was despite the console costing a whopping 869 D-Mark here, which was a lot of money at the time. But that didn't stop fans in Europe from queuing for hours and get their hands on a PlayStation 2. Never before has there been such hype, such hysteria about a video game console. But yeah, the built-in DVD player played a decision role here too. Unlike in the US, we only get 16 launch games. The majority of the European lineup was the same as the US lineup. We got Dynasty Warriors 2, Fantavision, NHL 2001, Orphan Sign of Sorcery, Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, Ridge Racer 5, Silent Scope, Smuggler's Run, SSX, Tekken Tag Tournament, Timesplitters and Wild Wild Racing. We also got Aqua Aqua, a nice puzzle game and successor to the N64 game Vetrix, a Gradius collection from Konami, which included Gradius 3 and 4, although the games on the PS2 already seemed very outdated, as well as the two soccer games FIFA 2001 from EA and ISS from Konami. The big hit was also missing here in Germany, a game that impressively demonstrated the power of the PS2, a title that offered what Sony had promised to us all with the tech demos. With the solid but not outstanding launch lineup, the PS2 was also snapped up as a DVD player in Europe, and PlayStation fans were at least able to choose a few games from a varied portfolio. Compared to console sales, most PS2 games remained on the shelves like lead. The graphics of the launch games were poor and not even close to what Sony had promised beforehand. The head of Sony of Europe admitted this when asked about in an interview. Sony had promised graphics on par with Toy Story, but had not kept the promise in the slightest, said Sony of Europe headquarters. Things had to improve soon. And while PlayStation fans were busy with their consoles at the end of the year, Sony took stock. 6.4 million PS2 consoles were sold worldwide in the launch year. In contrast, 7.79 million PS1 systems were sold. And yes, of course, the PS1 had a clear lead, if only because of the immense games library. But Sony was still quite happy with just under 6.5 million consoles sold, and released Dark Cloud, developed by Level 5 during the Christmas season, at least in Japan. And yet, out of the 93 PS2 games released in 2000s, not a single one was a real system seller. Even Ridge Racer 5, one of the console's flagship titles, only sold just under 690,000 copies in Japan. It was the only PS2 game in the top 10 of the annual charts in Japan. In the West, not a single PS2 game had made it into the top 10 of the most successful games of the year. Ridge Racer 5, Tekken, Dark Cloud, all of these potential hits landed in the 70s. The games from Software, Gradius from Konami or The Bouncer from Squaresoft, which was released in Japan in 2000, were disappointing across the board. In addition, many PS2 games were already available on N64 and Dreamcast, such as Ready to Rumble Boxing Round 2, Operation Winback, Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore or Rayman 2. If you looked for a direct comparison with the Dreamcast, you even noticed that the games on Sega's system looked better graphically than with Sony's Emotion Engine. The reason for this was quickly found. The new development environment made programming video games on the PlayStation 2 significantly more complex than on any other console before it. Development studios had a hard time making proper use of the potential of the Emotion Engine. Sony was aware of this and offered studios help. This was both technical and monetary in nature. On the one hand, Sony's own programming team helped developers from other studios to better understand the PS2 hardware. On the other hand, Sony increasingly reached out for its wallet to secure exclusive deals on the PlayStation 2. This was also confirmed in an interview by Chris Deering, head of Sony of Europe at the time of the 6th console generation. Of sitting down with the head of Take-Two one day. It was about the exclusive rights to State of Emergency, which was released exclusively on the PS2 before later being released on Microsoft's Xbox. During this conversation, Deering casually asked the Take-Two boss whether he had anything else to offer, and he replied that they were currently working on a new 3D Grand Theft Auto that was being developed for Sega's Dreamcast. One thing led to another. After the conversation, the development of GTA 3 was reconsidered and Take-Two decided to cancel the game on the Dreamcast and develop it for the PlayStation 2 instead. Thanks to the help offered, the keen interest in exclusive games and the offer to cover the advertising costs for development studios, Sony secured a whole series of commitments from well-known game studios such as Namco, Take-Two, Rockstar and Squaresoft at the end of 2000. So it probably didn't matter that much that at the end of the year a rather unusual trick was making the rounds in the PS2 community. The so-called swap disk method allowed PS2 owners to pull out the PS2's disk drive without pressing the reject button. An original game was then swapped with an important game or a self-burned copy and put back into the console. This meant that imports could be played on any PS2 and pirated copies also became increasingly popular on the still young PlayStation 2. But it didn't seem to bother Sony much. After all, they had already profited greatly from pirated copies in the PS1 era. 2001 began with a big bang that briefly threw the video game world into disarray. On January 31st, Sega announced that it was leaving the console business and would stop production of the Dreamcast completely on March 31st, 2001. From then on, the company wanted to act as a third-party publisher and release its games on all three 6th generation consoles. The first was Crazy Taxi, which would be released for Sony's PlayStation 2 in March. The video game world was suddenly a different place. With Sega, the industry had lost a large and important player, while for Sony it developed into a best-case scenario. They had gotten rid of one of their biggest competitors and also had managed to win over a large publisher for their system. Sony had virtually single-handedly driven Sega into ruin with decisions that Sega was solely responsible for, playing a key role. But the PlayStation 1 and especially the PS2 had ensured that the mainstream had almost completely forgotten about Sega's consoles in 2001. A little later, Bill Gates stood on stage and presented the new Xbox, a home console that had the architecture of a PC and was supposed to be around 2 times more powerful than the PS2. Sony, however, took the announcement calmly. The PS2 had already sold 9.1 million units in its first year alone, and given that the new releases that Sony had planned for 2001, there was no reason to worry. Even Nintendo, which had introduced the Gamecube at the end of 2000, could not generate anywhere near the level of attention that Sony had with the PlayStation 2. And as if they had foreseen it, 3 really strong titles for the PlayStation 2 were released at the same time as the Xbox announcement in March. Squaresoft brought the Bouncer to the West, and even if the beat-em-up didn't match the hoped-for success of other Squaresoft games, the game still impressively demonstrated what a PS2 was technically capable of. The Bouncer offered excellent graphics that were only known from the pre-rendered cutscenes from the PS2 days. Capcom released Onimusha in the US before the game was due to be released in Europe in July. The action-adventure, originally planned as Resident Evil, received high ratings and was considered by many to be a reason to buy a PS2. And Konami's mastermind Hideo Kojima unleashed his new baby called Zone of the Enders on the gamers. The mech action game wasn't as deep as Metal Gear Solid in terms of gameplay, but it scored points with its presentation and rich action. Then in May, the E3 was just around the corner again, and the whole gaming world was looking at Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo. All 3 manufacturers had their new systems with them, and while Nintendo showed a trailer for the new Super Smash Bros. Game, which got the crowd cheering, and Microsoft gave a glimpse of Halo, Sony's press conference was all about the exclusive games that they had either developed internally or bought in. A trailer for Gran Turismo 3 was shown, which impressed with its magnificent graphics and overshadowed everything that one was used to visually from Gran Turismo 2. Then Jason Rubin and Andy Garvin took to the stage. The 2 founding members of Naughty Dog presented their brand new game to the public, Jak and Daxter. The 3D platform game was not only meant to impress with its charming characters and a self-contained connected world, but also to be a sign that you don't have to buy a Nintendo console if you want to play good 3D platform games. Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was responsible for Final Fantasy at Squaresoft, was then brought on board. He spoke about the power of the PlayStation 2 and brought a new trailer for Final Fantasy X with him, which looked really breathtaking and was due to be released in Japan in July and in the West at the end of the year. This was followed by appearances by Shinji Mikami, who spoke about Devil May Cry, and members of the Silent Hill team from Konami, who showed first gameplay of Silent Hill 2. The presentation was concluded with a new Metal Gear Solid 2 trailer, and the audience understood that Sony was assured of high-quality support from the development studios. And the fact that the games shown were also to be available exclusively for PS2 made the console an absolute must-have, regardless of its DVD playback capability. This was also increasingly evident among the many other software manufacturers who visited the E3 and presented their games. The majority of all third-party games were either a PlayStation 2 exclusive or were released directly for all 3 platforms, so that the impression was increasingly created that Sony offered the only console that gamers should have. This was reinforced by a price reduction when Sony lowered the price for the PlayStation 2 in Japan to 29,800 yen, thus getting closer to Nintendo. In Europe, however, we had to be a little patient. Here in Germany, the price of the PlayStation 2 was only reduced to 599 D-Mark on September 28th. After the E3, an avalanche of exclusive titles rolled in, which were intended to help further consolidate the market position of the PlayStation 2. It started with Twisted Metal Black, which was released in the US in June and was Sony's first-party game of the year. Racing game fans were looking forward to July because with Gran Turismo 3 Aceback, the PlayStation 2 got its first real system seller, which became a must-buy for racing game fans. With an average score of whopping 95%, there was no getting around the racing game. In August, PlayStation 2 owners were able to take a short breather and spend a lot of time with Gran Turismo and Twisted Metal Black, before one blockbuster after another was released from September onwards. Silent Hill 2 and Ico received top scores in September and quickly achieved cult status, which both games still have today. Then October came and Capcom released the next game after Onimusha, which had started development as a new Resident Evil game. However, as it was too action heavy, they changed the name and released Devil May Cry on the PlayStation 2, which was a huge success in no time and was expanded by Capcom into a whole series. And a title that, like no other, was responsible for the success of the PS2. While the first two GTA games on the PlayStation were fun sandbox games, Gran Turismo 3 turned out to be a gaming revolution that offered a new level of freedom that had never been seen before at the end of 2001. Wrapping up in an appealing 3D graphics framework that allowed players to move freely around the game world, GTA 3 managed to keep fans glued to their controllers like no other game. Scores in the high 90s, dozens of awards and a few controversies, mostly of political nature, ensured that every halfway grown-up video game fan wanted to get their hands on GTA 3. At the end of 2001, this was only possible on the PlayStation 2, which gave the console an immense sales boost. And as if that wasn't enough, Metal Gear Solid 2 was launched in November and showed what a high-quality, film-free video game with a gripping and profound story could look like. The year ended for Sony fans with 3 absolute top-class releases in December. Naughty Dog released Jak and Daxter and with a 3D platformer made good on all the promises that had been made beforehand. Not only was it significantly better and more sophisticated than any Crash Bandicoot game, but it was also one of the best the genre had to offer in terms of gameplay and visuals. Role-playing fans were also happy about Shadow Hearts, a dark JRPG from Midway, if they even had it on their radar, because there was a good chance that every role-playing game in December would be overshadowed by the magnificent Final Fantasy X. The 10th game of the main series scored with an emotional story that ultimately moved many fans to tears and packed the adventure in an unprecedented visual graphical design. Starting with the characters, the different environments and the tactical combat system, Final Fantasy X was one of the best looking games of all time and was also a great game to play. There was also an incredibly good soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu and high quality cutscenes that were in no way inferior to the Final Fantasy movie that was in production at the same time. For many, Final Fantasy X was and is the best in the series, including me. After Sony was criticized for a whole year for not offering a real system seller for its PlayStation 2, the company released 7 games in 6 months, all of which were considered system sellers and are still played with enthusiasm to this day. This second half of 2001 ultimately ensured that the PS2 was no longer perceived by the masses as just a DVD player with a PlayStation bonus, but as a PS2 console with a DVD bonus. The tide has turned for Sony and the console was finally profitable, so that the price adjustment in May no longer hurt. 20 million PS2 consoles sold spoke a very clear language. Sony had sold more consoles than Microsoft and Nintendo combined. Pirated copies certainly played a decisive role again. After the swap disk method had already become known at the end of 2000, the first mod chips started making the rounds at the end of 2001. The Messiah chip was the first easily accessible mod chip that, after modification, allowed imports and burnt games to be played on the console, which of course made the PlayStation 2 interesting for everyone who was not averse to these ambivalent waters and wanted to experience new games without spending a lot of money. Yes, the DVD functionality was definitely a driver, but from this point onwards the winner was determined by the games, and Sony had impressively demonstrated that they did not do things by halves in this area. And the mass of announcements and new releases proved that the journey had only just begun. The new year started for PS2 owners in the US with another exclusive title when Sony released Parappa the Rapper 2, continuing the popular rhythm game of the PS1 era. More hype was generated by Virtua Fighter 4, which was released in Japan in January and continued the incredible popular fighting game series, which was seen as the Sega flagship in the past on the PS2. The timing of the release was not chosen by chance, because just a short time later Microsoft started selling the Xbox in the land of the rising sun. Unfortunately, the American console was a huge flop from the start and sat like lead on the shelves. The Japanese thought the Xbox was too big, too bulky and not attractive enough. They preferred the Nintendo Gamecube and even more the PlayStation 2 with all exclusive titles such as Virtua Fighter 4. On the launch day of the Xbox in Japan, February 22nd, 2002, Sony and Squaresoft also announced the release date for Final Fantasy XI and emphasized again that the anticipated role-playing game would be released exclusively on Sony's console and playable online. Another clear dig at Microsoft, who of course put online capability at the forefront of their console, but had little impact in Japan. As far as new releases are considered, PS2 fans were delighted in February with Maximo Ghost of Glory, Fatal Frame, which would be released in Europe in August as Project Zero, and Wipeout Fusion, to name just a few top titles. Maximo was the three-dimensional sequel to Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins series, and impressed with equally tough level of difficulty and a new hero, which actually made the whole thing a reboot. With Fatal Frame, horror fans were treated to a somewhat different horror game that focused on a camera that you could use to hunt ghosts. Despite average scores, the game was so successful that Tecmo immediately began developing a sequel and expanded the game into a whole series. And I don't need to say much about Wipeout, do I? In the PS1 era, the Wipeout games were among the really big must-have games, so it was only a matter of time before Sony commissioned Psygnosis, who were now known as Studio Liverpool, to make a sequel for the new console. When the Xbox was released in Europe in March, Sony repeated the move with Virtua Fighter 4 and put the game on shelves in the West, although the game was firstly available in the US and only in May, just in time for the Nintendo Gamecube launch in Europe. The Xbox fared better here than in Japan. Microsoft had a successful launch and sold a lot of consoles and games, even if the Americans didn't come close to Sony's numbers. Europe was simply too closely tied to the Sony camp for that, which hasn't changed to this day. Sony then became a little more active in May, just in time for the European release of Nintendo's Gamecube. Final Fantasy XI was launched in Japan and thrilled role-playing game fans as the first online MMO on the console, while American PlayStation 2 fans were delighted with Medal of Honor Frontline, which was only available on Sony's console for a limited time. In addition, the price of the PS2 was reduced to $199 in the States, bringing it level with Nintendo. In Europe, we had to wait until August 28th before Sony reduced the price to €249 here too. The price drop in the US caused a real price war, as Microsoft also reduced the price of its console to $199 and sold the Xbox at a significant loss. We gamers were happy and looked forward to E3 in the same month, which was again held in Los Angeles and in 2002 was all about next-gen games that would be released in large numbers on all three consoles. All three manufacturers had brought exclusive games with them. But third-party studios were also not stingy with top titles, most of which were available on all three platforms. However, there were again many games from external studios that would only be released on the PlayStation 2. Nintendo showed a new 3D Mario, then Star Fox Adventures from Rare, before moving to Metroid Prime and a new Zelda, and even ended the show with a look at F-Zero GX, which was developed by former competitor Sega. Of all things, as a GameCube owner and Nintendo fan, you were very happy with the material shown. But Microsoft also had many great games in its luggage, such as Blinks, Crimson Skies and Brute Force, all of which were only available on the Xbox and made you want more. The winner of the entire E3 2002 was without question Sony. The mix of first-party games, exclusive third-party games and all other third-party titles that would also be released for PlayStation 2 alongside Xbox and Gamecube was simply unbeatable and clearly showed that the console war was decided by the games alone. The Getaway, Ratchet & Clank, SOCOM, Wild Arms 3 and Sly Cooper were among the hotly anticipated first-party titles from Sony, which covered several genres and were due to be released in the coming months. But it didn't stop there. Squaresoft showed Kingdom Hearts, an action RPG that combined the world of Disney with the Final Fantasy universe and promised an adventure like no other. Rockstar wanted to release Grand Theft Auto Vice City again only on the PS2, even if it would only be a time-exclusive release. Until Vice City and its predecessor were also available on the Xbox in 2003, the PlayStation 2 was the only console on which the games could be played, which almost single-handedly gave Sony an incredible successful Christmas business. But let me give you an example of how successful the software replenishment was in the second half of 2002. Here you can see 18 absolute must-have games that were released worldwide for the PS2. 13 of them were PlayStation 2 exclusive titles that were not available from Nintendo or Microsoft. Talking about all of the games mentioned would definitely go beyond the scope of this video, but I would like to mention a few titles. The Mark of Cree, for example, was an extremely interesting action-adventure from Sony, which not only appealed due to its fresh setting, but also its controls, which took some getting used to at first, but were also quite intuitive. The game sold well and got a successor, Rise of the Kasai, which was not released in Europe however. Capcom brought a very good sequel, Onimusha 2, which made it clear that the publisher was serious about the series and that it was slowly but surely developing into another trademark for brutal action in the PS2 camp. Konami was not idle either and continued its popular Suikoden series, which unfortunately did not make the jump to Europe with the third part. The classic role-playing game was said to have a somewhat slow start, but once you were in, you got the usual high-quality RPG fare that kept you glued to the controller for hours. And while we are on the subject of role-playing games that were already very popular on the previous console, we can also take a quick look at Wild Arms 3. Sony didn't release the second part for the PS1 in Europe, but the third game was a very nice cel-shading role-playing game set in the Wild West, which impressed with a dynamic combat system and 3 playable characters. And with Ratchet & Clank and Sly Raccoon, there were 2 absolute top-class platform games from Sony and Insomniac, or Sucker Punch, that couldn't be more different. While Ratchet & Clank combined platform gameplay with elements of a third-person shooter, Sly Raccoon offered not only fantastic cel-shading visuals but also well-implemented stealth passages that livened up the jump-and-run gameplay. Both games were extremely well received by PS2 owners, and together with Jak and Daxter were built into a whole series that even spoiled Nintendo fans were jealous of. It's no wonder then that Sony had sold an incredible 50 million consoles by the end of 2002, the Gamecube with its 9.35 million units sold and the Xbox with 8 million units sold didn't even come close. The PlayStation 2 was the fastest selling console in history at that time. The console war was decided. With over 50 million consoles sold and demand still immense, Sony's PlayStation naturally continued to attract countless developers who wanted to try their luck on the most successful console of all time. The software output grew from year to year. While around 93 PS2 games were released worldwide in the launch year of 2000, by 2002 there were already 392, and in 2003 there were an incredible 435 games that saw the light of day on the PlayStation 2. Of course, these were not all top titles. As with every other successful console, a lot of shovelware was released, but the number of top-class games was still significantly higher than with the competing consoles. PS2 owners were delighted with must-have games almost every week, even if some of them fell short of the developers' expectations, such as The Getaway, which was released in January 2003 and told a thrilling crime story on the streets of London. Unfortunately, the third-person shooter suffered from choppy controls and an unbalanced level of difficulty, so that Sony's first-party title never achieved the success of a GTA. A similar fate befell Devil May Cry 2, which was released in the same month and fell far short of Capcom's expectations. Fans and the press condemned it as graphically and gameplay-wise boring, so the developers could do nothing but promise improvements with the successor. In February, Western PS2 fans were delighted with Dark Chronicle, which was again developed by Level 5 and had already been released in Japan in December 2002. Their successor to Dark Cloud was better in all areas and combined action-packed gameplay with great graphics and a city-building aspect that kept you glued to the controller. Xenosaga Episode 1 made its debut in Japan. The game, produced by Namco, was developed by a small studio called Monolith Soft, which in turn consisted of former Squaresoft veterans and had created a profound sci-fi role-playing game with Xenosaga. In March, figures from the past Christmas business were announced. Nintendo and Sony were neck to neck, which was mainly due to games like Mario Party 4 and Zelda The Wind Waker, which had given Nintendo a boost during the Christmas season. But Sony wasn't too worried, the competition was too far behind for that. Nevertheless, the company announced a further price reduction. From May, the PlayStation 2 would only be available for $197 in the States and €199 in Europe. The release of Zone of the Enders 2, Primal and Final Fantasy X-2, which was released in Japan in March, ensured that hardware sales continued to increase and Sony was already aiming for 100 million units. The announcement that Dragon Quest VIII would be released exclusively on the PlayStation 2 also caused hype and finally decided the console war. When the E3 began in May, analysts and the press wondered whether Sony would say anything about the next console, which was rumored to already be in development. As early as 2002, insider reports indicated that Sony was working with IMB and Toshiba on a new processor architecture. The fact that Sony had kept interest in the handheld market, dominated by Nintendo, also made fans sit up and take notice in the hope of a new Sony handheld. However, other exclusive titles were first presented at the E3 press conference, such as the action game Rise to Honor, in which Hollywood star Jet Li played the lead role. Polyphony Digital then showed the first moving images of the eagerly awaited Gran Turismo 4 before Sony demonstrated iToy, a new way of playing video games made possible by a camera that would be connected to the PS2. This meant that players became the main character themselves and could interact with other characters and objects. And as the presentation drew to a close, Ken Kutaragi took to the stage and announced the PSP, a portable device that would shake up the handheld market. The release window was set to 2004 so that Sony could continue to concentrate fully on the PlayStation 2 in the second half of the year, although by this time the console had already established itself as a self-runner that no longer needed to be promoted. The constant supply of software with high-quality games ensured that the PlayStation 2 practically sold itself. Sony only had to release a few first-party games at various intervals, and other developers took care of the rest. Even as things don't always go smoothly, as we saw in June with Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness. The ambitious sixth part of the popular action-adventure series about Lara Croft was so buggy that it was almost unplayable and flopped badly at the box office, which led to a restructuring of the franchise. Fortunately, Sony proved to have a lucky hand with iToy and had a huge success with the innovative game concept. The first iToy was released in July in a bundle with a camera and was perceived by the press as innovative family fun that people were only used from Nintendo. The ease of use made iToy interesting for all age groups, even if some hardcore gamers criticized the limited depth of the game. But that didn't affect its success. By the end of 2003, iToy had sold over 2 million copies and spawned many successors on the PS2. Today, iToy is considered an important forerunner for later motion technologies, such as those seen in the Wii and Microsoft's Kinect. The rest of the year was again marked by a number of high-profile exclusive games that appeared amidst a flood of third-party titles. And even if the output of 2002 was not reached in terms of number of exclusive games, games such as Jak 2, Castlevania and SSX 3 in October and Ratchet & Clank 2 in November were a hit. As a Christmas title, Squaresoft also released Final Fantasy X-2 in November, which was not as well received as its direct predecessor, but still sold extremely well and offered Final Fantasy fans a lot of fun. 20 million PS2 consoles were sold in stores around the world in 2003 alone, raising total sales to an incredible 70 million. It is also interesting that on December 13th, Sony brought a hybrid console onto the Japanese market, known as the PSX, which combined a digital video recorder with the PS2. The device was visually very different from the conventional PlayStation 2 and presented itself as a stylish multimedia device for the living room, including the option of saving movies and series based on the integrated hard drive for storing music or pictures. Unfortunately, at 69,800 yen for the 60GB version and 79,800 yen for the 250GB version, it was more than twice as expensive as the normal PS2, and the PSX flopped due to the error-prone technology, which meant that DVDs were no longer read, which prevented a release in the West. This is the first device to have Sony's cross-media bar integrated, which we Europeans would first see in the PSP and later in the PS3. At the end of 2002, just under 29 million units were sold, but by the end of March 2004, this number has grown to 71 million. Demand for the PS2 was unbroken, but from 2004 onwards, the console was not selling as quickly as in previous years. By the end of the fiscal year in March 2005, the number of consoles sold was set to rise to 87.47 million, which was still an incredible amount, but on closer inspection the curve flattened. This is due to several factors. The PSP, Sony's first mobile game console, was set to launch in 2004. In addition, Nintendo promised an innovative gaming experience with the Nintendo 3DS that many people did not want to miss. And then there were the rumors about the next generation. All three manufacturers worked on new hardware, and buyers were a little more cautious, putting money aside so that they could buy soon a new, even more powerful console. Sony was still gaining a big profit, and there was also a great supply of software. 495 games were due to be released for the PS2 in 2004, and there was no sign of a decline. The development studios had the Emotion Engine under control, which was reflected in the general quality of the games. In January, Capcom released Maximo vs. the Army of Sin, before Sony released their exclusive Jet Li game in February, an attempt to cross Hollywood-style action with a video game. Unfortunately, the game didn't really manage to convince the critics, which was mainly due to the controls, which took some getting used to. In March, American Final Fantasy fans could look forward to the online take on the Final Fantasy formula, while horror fans were busy with Resident Evil Outbreak, which also had a full online mode. Capcom followed a month later and completed the Onimusha trilogy. This time they also secured prominent support from Hollywood by signing Jean Reno as a playable character. On March 21st, Sony turned its own console into a karaoke machine and started a trend that ensured that the PlayStation 2 was not only bought by gamers and movie junkies, but also by people who otherwise had nothing to do with video games. SingStar was the magic software that triggered this hype. Armed with two microphones that could be connected to the console with an adapter, it was possible to sing along to various chart hits, which quickly developed into an absolute party phenomenon. The PlayStation 2 became a social magnet overnight, pulled out at parties to sing along to songs with friends and family. This worked particularly well in Europe, where SingStar was by far the biggest success and never completely disappeared until the end of the PS2 era. 2 million SingStar games sold by the end of 2004 proved Sony was right. And as we had to expect, the second half of the year was awash with top titles that underpinned the PS2's market position. In September, Burnout 3, one of the best, if not the best, arcade racing game was released. Konami released Silent Hill 4, breaking new ground, while Sony itself continued the adventure of Sly Cooper with the second part, and RPG fans were delighted with Shadow Hearts 2, which was even better than its predecessor. October was all about GTA San Andreas. Rockstar's new open world game was set to break all records and become the most successful PlayStation 2 game of all time, with a huge game world full of possibilities, a well-written story, and the tried and tested gameplay that was expanded to include dozens of new elements. Rockstar sold 4.5 million units in the first week, and by the time production of the PlayStation 2 stopped, an incredible 17 million games had been sold. Besides GTA, October was all about the third parts of well-known video game series. Sony itself unleashed Ratchet & Clank 3 and Jak 3 on fans, while stealth fans were looking forward to Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, which once again impressively demonstrated why Hideo Kojima was one of the best video game designers in the world. And a small studio from the Netherlands released a first-person shooter called Killzone under Sony's banner, which was initially described as a Halo killer, but never reached the class of the Microsoft hit. Nevertheless, Killzone was a great game with a dark atmosphere that would be continued in subsequent installments. Sony had saved Gran Turismo 4 as a Christmas title, which was released in Japan in December and would be launched in the US and Europe in February or March of the following year. The racing game was the best that genre fans had seen all across all consoles at that time. The graphics, the number of events and cars, Gran Turismo 4 offered content for several weeks and months, which fans naturally accepted with open arms and still celebrates the game as the best part of the series to this day. Sony also celebrated the release of the PS2 Slim, which was first released in Europe in October and then in the US and Japan in November. Basically, it was a scaled down version of the PS2 that could still play PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 1 games and DVDs. In order to keep the size as compact as possible, Sony made a few changes. The power supply was removed from the case and the expansion slot was also eliminated. This meant that the hard drive could no longer be used, which some fans criticized, as games like Final Fantasy XI, which required a hard drive, could not be played on the PS2 Slim. Later revisions of the PS2 Slim also no longer included the technical components that were necessary for playing PS1 titles. Sony therefore relied on software emulation for these Slim models, which led to some PlayStation 1 games causing problems. But yeah, with two models, thousands of games, innovative game concepts like SingStar and iToy, and almost 85 million units sold, Sony continued to dominate the market at the end of 2004, even though the Nintendo DS also became a massive success and left the PSP behind on the handheld market. Sony had not missed the new market of casual gamers though, as they had impressively demonstrated with SingStar and iToy, but for 2005 they had something brand new up their sleeves that would excite casual gamers on the PS2. 2005 was to be a year of contracts for Sony. The company's focus was clearly on further strengthening the PSP in the handheld market, so as not to lose even more market share to Nintendo and its DS. Sony was also working hard internally on the PlayStation 3, which was presented to the public at the E3 in May. And as has been the case with new hardware in the past, it was assumed that interest in the PS2 would slowly but surely wane. But that was not the case at all. The PlayStation 2 still performed very well in 2005, which was due to the exclusive games already mentioned, a generally strong sixth console generation, and the many innovative elements such as SingStar, iToy, and the built-in DVD player. The number of new releases also reached its peak this year, with over 520 new games being released worldwide. Sony also broke a record in November when it announced that it had sold 100 million PlayStation 2 consoles, something that no other hardware manufacturer had managed before them, especially not in a short period of just 5 years and 9 months. Sony managed all of this in an environment in which Microsoft was releasing the next generation and Nintendo was generating a lot of attention with the DS. The Xbox 360 was presented in more detail at the E3 in May 2005 and was due to be released worldwide in November of this year. Sony was of course prepared and presented its own PlayStation 3, which would not be available in stores until 2006. The release of the Xbox 360 did not affect PS2 sales figures, however. Game developers continued to support Sony's console very actively, also because they finally had the hardware under control and were able to conjure up a quality that found many buyers against the background of the install base of over 100 million consoles. But let's take a closer look at the notable games that were released for the PS2 in 2005. Let's start with The Getaway 2, which was released in January and again offered an adult plot, again set in London. The game once again relied on a cinematic story that was praised across the board by all press representatives. Unfortunately, The Getaway 2 made the same mistakes as its predecessor in terms of gameplay, which was also reflected in the ratings. Games like Xenosaga Episode 2, Gran Turismo 4, which finally came out in the West in February, and Tekken 5 all did better. All three titles received high scores and delighted PlayStation 2 fans. In March, Capcom kept its promise and delivered Devil May Cry 3, an incredibly good action game that made you forget the weakness of its predecessor. Better graphics, more action, and a brutal soundtrack positioned the game as one of the best character-driven action games of all time, which remains unmatched for many fans fans to this day. And while we are on the subject of character-driven action games, Sony and Santa Monica released God of War, an action spectacle of the highest order. As a vengeful Spartan, you were on the heels of the Greek gods and slaughtered your way across hordes of mythological creatures. Santa Monica managed to create a fabulous mix of dynamic gameplay, excellent graphics and a cinematic atmosphere, which achieved scores in the high 90s and scooped up numerous awards, making it one of the best games to hit the market in 2005. The third Sly Cooper installment was released in September, bringing the trilogy about the Master Chief to an end on the PlayStation 2. Sucker Punch Productions managed to create a truly first-class 3D platformer with stealth elements, which was enriched in the third installment with new ideas and more playable characters. Sony released the action title Genji, which was a bit reminiscent of Onimusha in terms of gameplay and put PS2 owners in the shoes of the samurai warrior Miyamoto Yoshitsune, who had to compete against the Taira clan. Genji, as one of the later PS2 exclusive games, was able to impress with impeccable playability and good graphics, which once again made it clear what the console was capable of. And then the jam-packed October began again, as was already a tradition at Sony. In addition to strong and well-reviewed games such as SOCOM 3, Jack X and Shadow of the Colossus, a version of the GameCube hit Resident Evil 4 was also released on the PlayStation 2. Capcom had claimed several times during its development for Nintendo's console that the game would not be technically feasible on the PS2, but after the GameCube began to falter and Capcom made the decision to release their important games on Sony's machine, enough adjustments were made to get Resident Evil 4 running on the PS2. Yes, it didn't look quite as stylish graphically as it did on the GameCube, but PS2 fans were still happy about the title, even though they were presented with two other absolute top-class games in October, with Ratchet Deadlocked and Soul Calibur 3. And then there were Buzz, which was launched in Europe and was the third gaming innovation that Sony had developed for the PS2 after iToy and SingStar. Buzz was a quiz game that was played with the help of special controllers. Every player was given one of these Buzz controllers and could select the correct answer at the touch of a button, which made the whole quiz show theme even more authentic. And like iToy and SingStar before, Buzz also became a fan favorite. Although the games and controllers never achieved the cult status of the camera or microphones, numerous quiz successors were nevertheless developed. A month later, the next phenomenon hit the PS2, Guitar Hero. The PS2 version of the rhythm and music game, complete with plastic guitar, was the only version that was released for the 6th generation of consoles. Gamecube and Xbox fans unfortunately missed out and had to resort to the versions for the next generation consoles. And anyone who didn't have rhythm in their veins was in for another absolute must-have in November, when Square Enix finally released Dragon Quest VIII in the West. The classic JRPG came with beautiful cel-shading graphics that made the entire adventure look like a playable anime drawn by Akira Toriyama. And after Dragon Quest VIII had already made a cash register's ring in Japan, Square Enix was able to repeat the success in the West and clearly show once again that the PlayStation 2 was an absolute must for RPG fans. Anyone who didn't get that could get Yakuza, which was released in Japan in December. The action-adventure from Sega was considered a spiritual successor to Shenmue, and in addition to good ratings, it also gained a large fanbase in a very short time, so Sega was not going to let it stop it and still producing successors to this day. Last but not least, there was Kingdom Hearts 2, which was also released in Japan in December and continued the magical mix of Disney and Final Fantasy while eliminating a few weaknesses of its predecessor, and was an absolute must-buy for genre fans, even if we in Europe had to wait until September 2006. At the end of the year, Sony was satisfied with over 100 million consoles sold, while they were busy working on the PlayStation 3 and continued to support the PSP with good games. Nevertheless, fans and the press wondered what would happen to the PS2 and its support if the PlayStation 3 was released next year as promised. In 2006, Sony sold 13 million PS2 consoles, which was a significant drop compared to the sales figures of recent years. Nevertheless, 13 million was far more than Sony was able to achieve with its new PlayStation 3. In direct comparison, 4 times more PS2 consoles were sold this year than PS3 consoles, which was pretty crazy, especially considering that a new console generation had arrived at all 3 manufacturers in 2006. But Sony had miscalculated with the PS3. The new PlayStation stumbled and had trouble holding its own against the Nintendo Wii and the incredibly popular Xbox 360. But hey, that's a topic for another video. So let's look back at the PS2, which was supposed to get some really good games again in 2006. However, the titles we are about to talk were no longer in the same spheres as the games of recent years. Games like Ape Escape 3, Shadow Hearts 3 or Onimusha Dawn of Dreams were still very good, but they no longer attracted the desired attention because most people had already said goodbye to the 6th console generation and had their eyes on one of the new consoles. And then there were games like 24 the Game, a first-party game from the studio that made Primal, based on a successful TV series. And although it was very solid in terms of gameplay and presentation, it got lost in the race for dominance in the 7th generation. At least 24 the Game was still released here in Europe. Other development studios such as Square Enix, Namco or Sega had decided at that time not to release some promising games like Xenosaga Episode 3 or Grandia 3 here at all, much to the annoyance of millions of PS2 owners who had to resort to imports or pirated copies. But at least the second half of the year still offered a few real bangers, like Dirge of Cerberus, an action-packed spin-off in the Final Fantasy VII universe, or Okami from Capcom, which scored points with its beautiful picture book visuals and Zelda-inspired gameplay. Other promising games like Rule of Rose unfortunately weren't quite as well received, although Rule of Rose wasn't given much of a chance here in the West. Other notable games were the second part of Valkyrie Profile or Bully, a new game from Rockstar that was similar to GTA. And when Bully came out in October, RPG fans preferred to spend their money on Final Fantasy XII, which was convincing with its sci-fi inspired world, new combat system and bombastic presentation, but not every Final Fantasy fan liked the gameplay. The Christmas season in 2006 was also very interesting. While Sony launched Yakuza 2 back in Japan, Sony of Europe aimed its Christmas season almost entirely at the new target group of casual gamers, perhaps as a counterattack to Nintendo's Wii. In the last 2 months of the year alone, only titles for families and casual gamers were released. SingStar Legends, Buzz Junior Jungle Party, Buzz the Sports Quiz and the 2 Aitor games Play Sports and Kinetic Combat. At the same time, hardcore gamers were tried to be attracted to the PS3, but this did not put the PlayStation 2 at a disadvantage, as Sony had sold around 115 million consoles by the end of 2006, which was certainly also due to the renewed price cut. From August 21st, 2006, the PlayStation 2 only cost 129 euros, and given the incredible games library, was an absolute bargain, which several million people would snap up in the years to come. Anyone who has even remotely been involved with the PlayStation 2 knows that Sony has sold around 155 million consoles by 2013. As the console sold 115 million units at the end of 2006, that means that around 40 million people would still be buying a PlayStation 2 between 2007 and 2013, which is pretty crazy considering the environment at the time. But Sony wouldn't be Sony if they hadn't used a few little tricks to achieve these numbers, as you'll see in a moment. Let's first look at the must-haves for the console that came out in 2007. You'll notice that the number of notable AAA games decreased with each year, which is of course logical, but I still wanted to mention it. Let's start with Rogue Galaxy, which was developed by Level 5 and finally released in the West in January 2007, more precisely in the USA. We Europeans had to wait until September of that year. But the wait was worth it, because Rogue Galaxy has become a fantastic role-playing action game that tells a planet-spawning journey and should not be missed by any RPG fans. March brought God of War 2, probably the best PS2 game of the year, which was again developed by Santa Monica and published by Sony. In the second part, Kratos continues to seek revenge and sets out to dethrone Zeus from the throne of the gods. The game was bigger, better and more beautiful. The developers pulled all triggers and programmed one of the best action games of all time, which really flexed the PS2 muscles. Definitely another reason to buy a PS2. It is also interesting that from March onwards, ports of successful PSP games were also available on the PS2. This meant that some developers filled up their PS2 coffers, earned a few more bucks, and Sony was happy about software support. A win-win situation for everyone. We are talking about GTA Vice City Stories and Burnout Dominator, two really great PSP games that could now be also played on the big screen using a traditional controller. The two role-playing games Odin Sphere and Dawn of Mana were released in May, although the official fourth part of the popular Mana series fell far short of expectations and was unfortunately never released in Europe. The RPG wave continued in August with Persona 3 and Wild Arms 5, although we Europeans had to wait until February 2008 for a PAL version of Persona 3. And last but not least, Fantasy Star Universe was released by Sega in November. Unfortunately, the latest spin on the famous Fantasy Star series also fell short of expectations, although the game offered a single-player mode and a purely online campaign. But yes, those are all the PS2 games worth mentioning from 2007. Perhaps Need for Speed Pro Street could also be included here, simply because of all 6th generation consoles the game only appeared on the PS2 and was otherwise only available on the systems of the new console generation and the handhelds. Thanks to the price adjustment at the end of 2006, Sony was able to record good growth despite reduced support for exclusive titles, and by the end of 2007 the figure was almost at 130 million units, and everyone was wondering when Sony would pull the plug on the PlayStation 2. Sony had no intention of stopping production of the PS2. As long as the console was selling well, they wanted to continue to offer it in stores, especially since there were still enough development studios that published games. For example, 3 interesting games came out in March. Firstly, there was Silent Hill Origins and Ratchet & Clank Size Matters. Both games were ports of successful PSP titles, but that didn't make them any less attractive to the millions of fans who still owned a PlayStation 2. And Sega gave the PS2 Sega Superstar Tennis, which was certainly also due to the immense install base, since Nintendo and Microsoft fans only got the game on the new consoles. From April onwards, however, the big new releases were limited. There was Persona 3 FES, an expanded version of the game from the previous year, and a PlayStation 2 version of the new Alone in the Dark game. In July, Atlus released the excellent Persona 4, while Sega brought the Yakuza 2 to the West in September, fulfilling the wish of many fans who didn't expect it. For the Christmas season, Square Enix gave all role-playing games a genuine remake of the GBA game Kingdom Hearts Chains of Memories. Unfortunately, this version was no longer released in Europe. 2009 continued as 2008 ended for PlayStation 2 fans. Those who were still busy playing with their PlayStation 2 consoles got a nice role-playing game with Alto Nalico, a last generation version of the latest Lara Croft adventure with Tomb Raider Underworld, and 2 first-party games in the form of MotorStorm Arctic Edge and Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier, even if these were once again just ports of PSP games that were already available. By this point it was clear that Sony was only supporting the PS2 with a modicum of support, and that most third-party manufacturers had already moved on. But in order to not write off PlayStation 2 sales completely, the company went ahead and released the console at a reduced price in previously untapped markets, such as Latin America and Africa. This meant that they could be sure that a few million more would be added to the 145 million recorded at the end of 2009. In 2010, 35 PS2 games were released, including ports of the PSP games Silent Hill Shattered Memories in January and Siphon Filter Logan's Shadow in June. Otherwise, active PS2 players got MLB 10, Madden NFL 11, FIFA 11 and PES 11. Basically the usual suspects that are still produced for the masses at the end of a console generation. As for us Europeans, Sony put a whole 6 SingStar games on the shelves. In 2011, the supply of games shrank to 11 games, including MLB 11 and WWE All-Stars in March, Madden NFL 12 in August, and FIFA 12, PES 12 and NBA 2K12 in September. The PlayStation 2 was officially only kept alive by Sony and the sports games. Nevertheless, an incredible 155 million units were sold, even if the numbers only increased slightly. This scenario repeated itself for 2012. In March, there was Major League Baseball 2K12 before FIFA 13, and Street Cricket Champions 2, which was released exclusively in Australia, were released in September. In November, PES 13 followed, before Square Enix gave all Japanese PS2 owners a great Christmas present in December and brought the Final Fantasy 25th Anniversary Ultimate Box on the market, a collection of all Final Fantasy games released up to that point. Today, this Anniversary Ultimate Box is considered an absolute collector's item that sells at exorbitant prices. In 2013, Sony finally realized that the end of the most successful console of all time had come. At the beginning of the year, they pulled the plug and announced that the production of the console would stop. A total of 3 games were released. Dawn 2, the game, which was only released in India and was based on a successful Bollywood film, and the 2 football games FIFA 14 and PES 14. And since Pro Evolution Soccer 14 was released a few days after FIFA, Konami's title is considered the last officially released PlayStation 2 game. The PlayStation 2 was history after more than 12 years. 155 million consoles were sold, although Sony recently revised upwards to 160 million. This makes it the most successful console of all time, breaking records and getting over 4,200 games, which is just crazy and had led to the formation of a very large fanbase that still adores the console and plays its game to this day. This can be done in different ways. Some download PS2 classics directly to their PS5, others still use their 25-year-old original consoles and collect all games with love and passion, while most probably use an emulator and play the classics on the PC, Steam Deck or the numerous retro handhelds. Most PS2 games have lost none of their charm and still clearly show today why the console became a such phenomenon back then. Yes, the DVD player was cool, but what made the PS2 so special and successful were the countless first and third party games. I went into some of them in this video, but there were simply too many great games to cover them all in one video. But yeah, that brings me to the end of my retrospective. I hope you enjoyed the video, even if it was a bit long. Feel free to share your memories and experiences with the PS2 in the comments. Let's celebrate the 25th birthday properly, and if you want, I would be happy if you would like to like it. Please share the video with other PlayStation 2 fans so that the console gets the recognition it deserves. In any case, thank you for your attention. Until next time here on Pixel Chronicles. Bye, your Andy.